Hello everyone, welcome to this Sydney Southeast Asia Centre Heritage in the Arts webinar. We're just going to let participants into the Zoom room, so bear with us for about 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get going. So we are coming to you live through Zoom tonight and also through the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre's Facebook page. And as I said, we'll get started in just a few seconds once everybody's joined. Thanks. Okay, well, while we're waiting for people to join, I will take this opportunity to introduce myself. I'm Natalie Pearson and I'm the Curriculum Coordinator at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. We've been running the SEAC webinar series all year, focused around our 5 research clusters. And this month, the month of September, we're focusing on heritage in the arts, which is fantastic because it's my area of interest. So I get to introduce my friends and colleagues from the University of Sydney. So before we begin tonight, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Sydney is built and based on Gadigal lands. And I'd like to pay my respects to the people who have cared for and continue to care for the country and lands on which the University of Sydney is built. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to invite you to acknowledge the traditional lands from where you're joining us tonight. So we are joined by Dr Beth Yahp from the Department of English at the University of Sydney, who is going to be speaking to us tonight about Distance and Closeness, a creative writer and teacher's autoethnographic adventures in Malaysia. So Beth has promised us that tonight is going to be about writing and not writing, and about writing the lives of others. It promises to be a really wonderful talk. Apparently she's also got some food photos lined up for us, for those of us missing Southeast Asian food. So Beth is currently the degree coordinator of creative writing in the Department of English, and she's also an acclaimed writer. Her fiction and creative non-fiction includes The Red Pearl and Other Stories, a memoir called Eat First, Talk Later, which was shortlisted for the 2018 Adelaide Festival Award for Literature, and a prize-winning novel, The Crocodile Fury. Beth wrote the libretto for composer Liza Lim's opera Moon Spirit Feasting, which won the APRA Award for Best Classical Composition in 2003. And she was co-chief investigator of the Reimagining Archives Narrative and the Visual Artifact Project in collaboration with Malaysia Design Archives. Beth, I'm really looking forward to your talk tonight. I'm going to hand it over to you for about 30 minutes or so, after which we will have a Q&A. So members of the audience, please feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll moderate the Q&A after Beth's finished her presentation. So over to you, Beth. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. Thank you for that great introduction. Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming along today in what's a busy time to another session in Zoom world. I'm zooming in from unceded Gadigal land on which I live and work, and I pay my respects also to the traditional custodians of this land, to elders past, present, and emerging, including those of you who may be among us today. I hope you will please forgive or at least indulge the scatty nature of this talk. I found when thinking about closeness and distance in relation to Malaysia, where I'd been returning to frequently for several years before COVID hit, to see my family and friends there in the guise of working on 2 research projects. I mean, as well as working on 2 research projects, when thinking about Malaysia, and particularly about writing about Malaysia, the enforced distance of this new world we live in hits home. And I find myself caught up in the narrative mess of trying to articulate a story. That is, caught up in the stuttering thinking and stuttering feeling that such messes throw up, especially when you attempt to make sense of it or force sense out of it and tell a coherent, digestible story, both for yourself and for others, as I'm trying to do now. Yet this is often the foremost challenge for a writer. So this talk, in which I proposed to recount autoethnographic adventures in Malaysia, I don't know what came over me, and also to address challenges and offer methodologies for engaging in life writing, that is, writing about people and events from life, including autobiographical fiction or fictional memoir, both of which I have written. This talk may turn out to be the story of not being able to tell a story, let alone write it. It may be the story of a failed research project. I'm speaking of my project to write about Malaysia Baru, the new Malaysia, that project of blood, sweat, and tears for my activist friends and for many, many, many Malaysians, but especially a project of hope that came to fruition in 2018 with the first change in government in Malaysian history since independence in 1957. Since 1918, a lot has happened. The newly elected reformist Pakatan Harapan Alliance of Hope's government fell in February 2020, just before Australia closed down for COVID, actually. And there have been 3 prime ministers in total since then, the latest nominated just 2 weeks ago on the 20th of August. In one sense, the hope for change that fueled the reformist politicians and activists in the 20 years leading up to Malaysia Baru produced more hope, and initially a change in the very air. Can't you feel it? Can't you smell it? One of my politician friends, Ellie Wong, answered when I asked her what was different about Malaysia Baru. The air is so fresh, she said. This was when I could travel to Malaysia in 2019. Tellingly, at that time, can you feel it? Can't you feel it? Can't you smell it? The air is so fresh. We were standing next to a longkang, an open drain at the time, inspecting blocked pipes and patiently listening to Ellie's constituents' complaints about persistent flooding. Tellingly, I mean you and I, here and now, we have moved from the larger canvas of a momentous segment of contemporary Malaysian history, regime change and all it promised, to a particular moment swirling about in its contrail, standing at a longkang, where the fresh air of a hopeful outlook, which all my activist friends harbored even in their darkest moments, is countered by the rotting slime of a blocked monsoon drain. Tellingly, in the essay I wrote about Malaysia Baru for the now banned anthology edited by Kian Wong, titled Rebirth, Reformasi, Resistance, and Hope on the Road to New Malaysia. So this was published in 2020. But in the essay I wrote for that anthology, I left out all the other particularities of that specific moment standing by the longkang. The sun-baked asphalt sticking to our shoes, the changed texture of the air as we stepped out of the air-conditioned SUV, the aroma of pork buns, a village specialty, rushed over on a motorbike as we were about to drive away, since my friend YB Ellie Wong had loved them so much the last time she visited. In today's talk, I'm going to use 3 entry points by 3 different writers that I find useful to frame my thinking, or rather to lasso my thinking into a space, visual, hopefully generative, where I can offer some thoughts on distance and closeness and a writer's attempts to square lived experiences, as well as our own lived experiences, as well as our subjects, with the narrative mess of life. When I speak of narrative mess, I'm referring to what Clive Baldwin describes in Ethics and the Tyranny of Narrative as the messiness in which a living story takes place before it becomes fixed by the narrativization process, before it gets turned into a coherent story. So here's what I'm starting with: 3 entry points, which I've just foreshadowed. And 2 stories and a blank page. The American short story writer Grace Paley said, "You don't have a story until you have two stories, at least two stories. That's what I always tell my students." She said, "That's a good place to start. It's better than this place that you're looking at now, which faces every writer at the start and even in the middle of something. Some things, writing, researching, teaching, reviewing, judging, admin, wearing several hats, sometimes all at once, as is usual for many writers, since most of us cannot survive on our writing, even if it's the most important thing, the thing which allows us to survive." So this is where we might start thinking about two kinds of stories, which is also a way of thinking about two perspectives and practices. Firstly, stories of distance with their macro perspective, and perhaps the distance of the French novelist, essayist, and general mischief maker, Georges Perec's Portolano makers, who saturated the coastlines with the names of harbors, the names of capes, the names of inlets, until in the end, the land was only separated from the sea by a continuous ribbon of text. I love the confidence of this venture, the inscribing of blank space through naming, the naming creating a map creating the world. I write, says Perec, I inhabit my sheet of paper, I travel across it, incite blanks, spaces, jumps in meaning, in discontinuities, transitions, changes of keys. There's such kind of wonderful playfulness to the venture, but mostly there's such confidence. But for me, stories of distance also invoke those without powers of naming blank spaces. For example, the stories of those who are inscribed as blank, nullius, not there. Or the stories of the migrant writer, like Salman Rushdie, arguing for his non-rose tinted lenses that see more clearly, he says. Or the post-colonial writer who resides in a settler colonial country, but writes often about the distant homeland, that writer, like me, Malaysian born, but having lived most of my life elsewhere, whose lingering coloniality manifests in what Filipino-Australian writer Melinda Bobis describes as the sometimes excruciating stretching process of globalization and the elasticity that is part of the transnational migrant writer's experience. The cultivation of an elastic imaginary which is continually disrupted by and may disrupt national, cultural, and categorical borders. That kind of the distance of being strung along or sprung on a rubber band is how I kind of think about it, which has been my movement between here in Sydney, back to Malaysia, back to here again, and then back there again. Something happens in that crossing of the distance, and there is something very much about the pull of that stretching process that has scattered us around the world. Distance allows perhaps a writerly or scholarly omniscience, the ability to stand back, stand above, and make sense from seeing more within the larger picture frame, from being far away, to connect it to other frames in order to tell a larger story or history, as I was trying to do in writing about Malaysia Baru, to see thematic threads and structural patterns which are not visible close up. Distance allows cool-headed judgments about importance and value, and if you're a writer, which sensations to include: smelly dream, baked asphalt, pork buns, or which of your darlings to kill. Distance allows you to decide which story gets to be included and who's relegated to the footnotes or margins, or whose becomes best represented by an empty field. Here's the second point of entry. Collective Amnesia, book of poems by South African poet and playwright Phuthuma Koleka, And I have to thank my colleague, Fiona Lee from the English department, who first brought this poem to my attention. So this collection explodes the idea of authority in various spaces, academia, religion, politics, relationships, and asks, what have we learned and what must be unlearned? It's powerful, it's a reminder, it's a revelation of all that has been forgotten and ignored, says its blurb. And it does that for me. So storytelling is the first poem in this collection. And for me, it's a disturbingly visceral highlighting of what is absent or has been erased from history, archives, or the official record. What I love is the maintaining of the structural or scholarly apparatus of Western storytelling, of knowledge making. It's Portolano makers steadfastly claiming their power to map what is not there and what is silent, not by filling in that space, as I have attempted to in all my story making about Malaysia and about my family in Malaysia, but by giving us an empty frame. In the unfolding of my story of shadowing and writing about Malaysian activists over the Reformasi years from 2004, I seem to have missed most of its major moments. Due to what? Luck, distance, laziness, tiredness, earning a living somewhere else? Or maybe the narrative mess of my and its living stories that have sometimes converged, but more often separated. For me, this poem both frames and amplifies a moment of loss that describes what is erased, but also what is missed, in both senses of the word, to miss out on something, but also to long for it, to miss it. A third entry point, a third example I found useful to think about stories of distance today, which will take us into the second kind of story I want to talk about, is this poem, Fieldwork by Alison Whittaker. And I love this poem because it gives us the field, the messiness of the field, the kind of gobbledygook that exists there when you don't understand a language or customs or anything much really. And after having lived away from Malaysia for such a long time, very strangely, not strangely at all, I found myself landing in this place of my birth that had radically changed, had become so different, and behaving like what I suppose an ethnographer or an anthropologist might behave like in the space, turning to a kind of attentiveness to strangeness, but also making sense, trying to make sense by asking, taking pictures and writing things down, throwing myself in an immersive way back into a country I was supposed to know. So Alison Whittaker is a Gomeroi writer and academic who grew up on the floodplains of Gunnedah in New South Wales. And this work, black work, kind of really speaks to me because it's kind of, it's been described as a discursively monumental collection, which asserts unwavering pressure on the idea of Australia in a voice seething with impatience, grief-stricken at the fate of this occupied place. And I was thinking, what this poem does, it makes me think of the occupation of that space in which we wish to insert ourselves as storytellers. Quite often the field is very crowded. It's crowded even if we can choose to think of it as empty because we don't know it, don't understand it, find ourselves sinking rather than swimming in the crowdedness of the field, from which we glean and nurture and try to pick our fruit. there's a couple of mixed metaphors there for you. So this story is a critique of the methodology, of course, from the perspective of a subject of fieldwork who speaks back as well as is spoken about. Don't mind me, I'm just here to answer questions you never asked. So it's, for me, it's, you know, from that distance of having gone away and become estranged and a stranger in this country of my birth, and yet with that that elasticity of the relationship being drawn back again and again to this place from which I, you know, came from and am constantly trying to make sense of, or rather to use as a kind of prism to make sense about the world, is a kind of warning, I guess, you know, to maybe tread lightly, think about the questions that are asked. But mostly it's also a reminder about the field already being occupied, you know, so what do we do with these layers of occupation, you know, that already exist in the field. Alongside this now so painfully enforced and embodied distance that we're all in, that I'm in, compounded by the lockdown of our bodies, are the stories of closeness. So I've spoken about, you know, different forms of stories of distance, but then, you know, here are the stories of closeness, the zooming in on the specificity of particular movements or particular moments in life or in memory that we so recommend to our writing students, those of us who teach writing. The adoption of ethnographic practices as we understand them, practices of immersion, attentiveness, note-taking in order to capture a telling moment, to pan for gold of something seen, heard, felt, spoken, or eaten, touched, that becomes a metaphor, an image that acts like a portal, smelly drain, baked asphalt, pork buns, and begins a process of opening for the reader, teleports the reader into another world. So these details I can pick and choose as I like when I'm in the field, when I'm among others. The thing that that kind of stops me always is I get the story that I want from the questions that I ask, right? So the questions that I ask already are working towards an untangling of the narrative mess, for better or for worse. In a sense, it's contributing to the trickery that is the narrativization process. This story is there because I have gone looking for it and I've chosen which sensory detail, which metaphor will best convey what I want to say. So when I was thinking about these kind of tiny details and, you know, things that the moments that I really missed in Malaysia, guess what came up? Ice Milo. And, oh, I feel so sad when I look at this, especially this. This is from Penang. We were talking about durian last week. You know, I think there's like kind of private importation of durian, but I have yet to get onto that pipeline. Very happy here looking at this gigantic dosai. I'm not sure what it's called actually. Is it a dosai or I've forgotten the name of it. And this also popped up. So strangely, food photos leapt out at me in terms of the details of the moments in which I lived in Malaysia. And this one also leapt out, a composite photo. It's also an illicit photo, one which I wasn't supposed to have taken and which I'll talk about a bit later on. So stories of closeness for me meant going small, going into those details, into the specific objects that became metaphors and portals into other worlds where I wasn't, and to a large extent, I cannot access. I didn't intend to become a memoirist. I started out as a kind of, adamant fiction writer in my writing career, but that seems to have, done the Uros Buros thing and come round to its exact opposite. So I didn't intend to become a memoirist, a kind of miniaturist of history in the making. Faced with a too large historical canvas, my reaction as a writer with a difficult relationship to the ways in which history is produced and consumed in Malaysia was to go small, to focus on the unnamed or invisible forces that may throw themselves together in a moment, a something both animated and inhabitable, as Kathleen Stewart writes in Ordinary Affects. The series of moments I entered into were part of Anwar Ibrahim's Reformasi movement, 1998 to 2018, which I wrote about in my fictional memoir, Eat First, Talk Later, and am currently supposedly updating. Thank you, COVID, for throwing a spanner in the works of that, resulting in more distance than closeness in my ability, and also, interestingly, in my desire to tell this story. The movement successfully overthrew the corrupt and long-lived former regime in May 2018, and New Malaysia was produced, populated, I would argue, by repetitions, doppelgangers, and returns. So the space of Malaysia Baru, which maybe we could talk about in the Q&A, if there is one, is that space of hope, because I remember that moment of the explosion of hope and disbelief, that happened in 2018 when the regime change came about. But it seemed to me in my tracking of Malaysia Baru was that there was a kind of population of the political space and also in the kind of the imaginary space, the space of stories, by old behaviors, by repetitions, by doppelgangers, by returns. Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad was back as the new reformist PM. A gay sex scandal like the one that toppled Anwar Ibrahim replayed itself, starring Anwar's own party deputy. Narratives of racial supremacy, dignity, and outrage still dominates policy and public discourse. And these returns or afterlives of the former regime resulted, it seemed to me at least, in anger and melancholy in former Reformasi stalwarts, and certainly in myself. I have found notions of racial melancholia as depathologized and productive, a useful way of entering into a shared consciousness of our common corporeal vulnerability, the story space that I wanted to inhabit, and owning up to, and perhaps even owning of the blank spaces, or the erased spaces, or the overcrowded spaces in which our lives and our narratives take place. It's a practice, thinking about melancholia as something productive, as depathologized, as repeated returning behaviors that reenact themselves over and over again, as something productive is, probably what I've been finding most difficult in my movement against trying to tell the, one particular story about Malaysia Baru. It's a practice that may take us out of dichotomous and antagonistic political racial imaginaries and ways of thinking about Malaysia in partisan and racialized polarities. Out of coloniality into decoloniality, as Melinda Bobis, quoting semiotician and literary theorist Walter Minolo, describes as the need to be de-linked from coloniality on a fundamental level of thought. As a storyteller, for me, that's the constant work, and the work that I find myself being pulled up on again and again, thinking about the ethics and the kind of responsibility and the relationality that's involved in telling the stories of real people, myself included, but all of the real people around me, whether I'm writing autobiographical fiction or writing, the less overtly fictional works of life writing. So writing small and writing close is perhaps a way of dealing with this not being able to cope with, these feelings of being unethical, or being irresponsible, or betrayal of the people whose stories you are trying to write. Writing small and close so that only fragments and discursive digressions are bearable. And this smallness and closeness, I'm hoping, may disrupt the overarching sense-making strengths of memoir or history as grand narrative in support of, other ways of imagining how lives may be written, how history may be written, and how politics may be written. I'm going to stop there. So I've got a really good question here, actually, about what is the, what is the blurry third picture on the screen. So this is, it's a couple of pictures that I took, and I put them up there because I wanted to talk about this smallness and closeness. And you might think that when I'm talking about smallness, closeness, going into a moment, in the way that I did, when talking about the smelly drain with Ellie, pulling out sensory detail to bring the reader into the space of, whatever it is that we want to evoke. I've been experimenting with how do we actually, what is the power of blurriness and not seeing, or being less transparent, in order to convey some quality of the moment that is that kind of honors the mess out of which that story arose. It's hard to do, and I'm not sure I've been successful at all in doing it. But it's an attempt to bridge the distance that I spoke about earlier, the distances, the different kinds of distances, the blankness, the crowdedness, the kind of confidence of naming, something as what happened, to give up on the grand narrative and sense making and attempts at coherence, and just step into the mess, the blurry, inchoate pastels of the moment, rather than its brilliant, arresting metaphors. So visualization is one technique to go into this, choosing a trigger, an object, a person, a moment, but kind of, working with what Toni Morrison called willed memory, the kind of bringing, so she says memory is actually not something that just is, like something that we can go into and it's always there. She says sometimes, especially for writers whose histories are, whose archives are incomplete, whose histories are also histories of silence, memory is an act of willed creation. So I'm kind of pairing that with that willed creation actually being kind of a bit blurry, and it doesn't matter that it's a bit blurry and not a complete coherent story. So I'm just going to read you. I don't know if I've got time, Natalie, or should I stop now? I just had a tiny...
You've definitely got time. Please go ahead.
Okay, so this is a piece of writing that came out of this blurry picture. And it's... I'm just gonna, I'll just read it. So one of my projects of kind of recounting these stories, which are, not complete, coherent, or, grand in any way, is to kind of document small moments and small pleasures, I've called them. I've got a small pleasures project And so this, the moment out of which these photos arose is the moment that I documented as a small pleasure, number 63. And the small pleasure, so the many ways we can define pleasure, right? So this small pleasure, number 63, is actually called Cancer Lottery. It's a few weeks before the fall. It's a few weeks before the fall of Pakatan Harapan, but we're not thinking about this as we drive through the suburbs of Taiping out to the outer suburbs, petering into little villages. My guides are a guest house manager, a political worker, and a former politician who lost her seat in the momentous elections of 2018. I'm still here, she tells me, here being her constituency of rubber estates and a fishing village. Still a lot of work to do, she says. We aren't speaking of politics or political infighting in her party. We're both relaxed and excited, armed with chicken curry and rice, which we've heard on the grapevine is what we need. Tonight, that's what we need. I'm supposed to be here in Malaysia, updating my out-of-date research on Malaysia Baru and how it's treating my Reformasi friends, once opposition activists, now in positions to govern. But I find myself more interested in chasing fortunes, slips of paper that tell me my fortune for the year after I've cast fortune sticks at the well-known crowded temples, crawling under an altar of the oldest Chinese temple in Kuala Lumpur's Chinatown, now searching for a famous medium in a Chinese fishing village who becomes a vessel for the goddess Kali, and who loves chicken curry. After circling bumpy roads and pitch black laneways, my friends and I arrive at a temple sited in a corner terrace house. It looks very ordinary. I wouldn't have been able to tell what it was if they weren't leading me here. We haven't made an appointment, and we catch the temple keepers and medium unawares, sitting in shorts and shirtless in the cool evening air. The medium is younger than I imagined. After some persuasion, even though we've brought the wrong curry, they let us in. Incense sticks, the uncovering of the god robed in red, candles, beer, rice grains, yellow pouches. The god deigns to grace us with her presence. Peers, laughs, asks questions, changes her clothes, asks for a sword, cuts her tongue, peers more, tells us what we've come to hear. I take a sneaky photo. The god pauses, looks, raises a hand at me. I lower my camera. On the way down, I take another photo. Did I mean to? The god tells me what I've come to hear. She says, I will win the lottery. But she says, I will die. And she tells me how. So this photo is, maybe you can see it, the very smoky shrine. I was thinking, actually, I really believe this, if the gods don't want you to do something, they won't let you show the photo, so this is a moment of, that we can use to think about, questions of whose lives are connected in the telling of any story, no matter how small you go. And no matter, so even though that vignette, brings us into a particular moment, it's blurry, not everybody, not everybody who was there is named or described. You can't see anybody. By the way, this one so that's the photo I took first, and that's the photo I took second, which is these are actually my knees, you can't tell. I was kind of taking it with the camera pointing down in an act of, terrible disobedience.
So Beth, can I just ask, is that it's not a digital photo then? Is it using an analog camera?
No, it was using a phone, because it wasn't,
Okay.
I wasn't allowed to, we weren't allowed to have cameras.
Yep, because it's quite
so it was
unusual.
Just a phone.
It's quite interesting to see that slippage happening on a phone, on a digital device, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't know why it. Yeah, I don't know. No, well, you haven't seen my phone photos. It was very, very low light. So I have to say it was like about midnight. So very, very grainy, low light. But I think that, for me, that, when looking at photos and thinking back about this whole process of documenting, and telling the stories of others while telling your own life story, it kind of, for me, it throws up that question of the evocative nature of something that you can't really see, and how do you actually convey that in writing, in text. But it also throws up the question of, the narrative mess. And within that mess are all of the lives that are involved, captured within the frame or just outside of the frame, and how they are all relational, So it's, when I tell the story of my life, it's not just the story of my life. It's actually a story of, Ellie at the longkang. It's the story of the other activists. It's the other, and how do we kind of square that with honoring the lives of others? It's a kind of real question that one needs to tussle with. If we say that lives are relational, then there is no life that is singular, and life becomes lives, and the auto in autobiography becomes a plural form. Point of view becomes collective. How do we convey that, and when that is so antithetical to, the ways in which we're asked to narrate stories? I'll stop there.
Listen, Beth, I could listen to you all evening, but we do have questions. I just wanted to pick up on that final point you made there about the lives of others, other humans. But I've also seen you in action in a workshop thinking about the lives of objects. So I wanted to ask you about this visualization methodology that you use, which actually links in with one of the questions we've got from the audience, which is about how you train to be able to write and express yourself in this way, and sort of what is your methodology and your practice for visualizing the lives of others and of the objects.
Reading, so if you want to write, that's always the first step, to see how other people do it, so it's always the models, right? Look at what people do and just think, can I do that? Can I do that better? How can I, how do I actually, where's my space in that, what other people are doing? It's also something about practice, so it's about writing practice. And for the most part, writing practice seems to be a practice of attentiveness, I think, mostly, so I know I write really badly when I stop paying attention. And I know I stop paying attention when I'm tired, when I'm busy, when I'm stressed out, when the narratives, that are coming at me are just so kind of different to my experience of them. So for example, in New South Wales, where, we're told we're going to celebrate soon. In our 10th week of lockdown, we're looking forward to freedom and celebrating. And somehow, along with that comes, more hospitalizations, more freaked out, kind of exhausted health workers, more deaths, and it's cause for celebration. On some level, I understand that, but I also affectively, my body, says, no, that's not the only story. There is something quite traumatic happening underneath here that perhaps, can only represent itself in this blurriness of feeling. So yeah, pay attention, and notice those things that you think are not worth noticing. And, so practice the writer's journal, the ethnographer's notebook is, fundamental. you know, if you're bad at drawing, just draw. If you're kind of just, you know, don't take pictures so much, because, you know, pictures just become another file, you know. So I think the drawing or the notes are much more, you know, they give you much more when you look at them later. So the thing about objects and lives, you know, so part of that also, Natalie, is about, you know, being open to kind of visualizing yourself in a different space to the one that you're in. You know, so the visualization object that with objects that we did at Chow Chak Wing, which was fantastic, by the way, the kids did amazing visualizations. You know, it's about actually taking that attentiveness from life and actually moving it into an imaginary space and treating that imagined space with the same kind of worthiness of attention that we give the world. You know, so it is, I guess, you know, the fundamental starting point is also thinking, you know, this world is worthy of being paid attention to, and so I should, you know, honor it in that way.
I also love the things that you're drawing our attention to. You know, you spoke earlier about the monsoon drain, and you know, commonly we would step over a drain, see it as a hindrance, as something smelly, as something to be kept out of sight. So the fact that you're drawing our attention to these things and giving them such respect and valuing them, I find absolutely fascinating. We do have some other questions which I'd like to come to, if that's okay. A couple of questions about your book, Malaysia Baru, but we might come to those at the end. First, I'd just like to read out a comment from Nikki Duncan, who's one of our Honours Bootcamp participants, actually, from earlier in the year. And Nikki says that your comments on Alison Whittaker's work about how we think a space is empty because we don't know it well, and find ourselves struggling to raise a voice in what we find to be a crowded place really resonated with her. And I have to agree with Nikki, that was a really interesting point. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, Beth.
It's maybe it's something about, you know, I don't know what it is about us humans, you know, we tend to gravitate towards the extremes, or we use the extremes to illustrate things. And, you know, so it's either fully empty or it's fully full, you know, and maybe, you know, the work is about trying to find, you know, that spot on the spectrum, you know, that has some space for me and some space for the things that I notice, that I bring to notice, you know. So I think, yeah, I mean, that if you haven't read the book, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the person who
Nikki.
asked. Nikki, yeah, Nikki, if you haven't read Whittaker, please go and look for her, because, you know, she works in this space of archival poetics. You know, so what she does is engages with archives, you know, in ways in which question, subvert, and call out the archive for the, you know, the excess of material on certain things and the dearth of material on other things, and also the frames in which the material is looked at. Yeah, so, you know, she's wonderful.
I might make a note of that. That also for myself as well. So a question that is connected to that, actually, in terms of finding space on that spectrum between noise and silence, maybe distance and closeness, is a question. Well, first of all, the questioner says that, Beth, you do so well to narrate internal intuitive conflicts that the questioner has also felt. Do you have any tips for moderating yourself between these extremes of distance and closeness? How can we navigate between feelings and behaviors of all or nothing? Great question.
Yeah, really great question. And it's so hard, yeah. You know, it's like, how do we do that? I mean, that is the question. You know, how do we, you know, how do we not react? It's yeah, I often wonder about this, you know. So like the kind of, we're in this really weird space now, I think, you know, with lockdowns and COVID and not being able to move, in that we're really confined, you know, so the body is confined, but at the same time we have so much access to digital everything, that it's a kind of bombardment, on us. I mean, the wonderful thing is that you can go to webinars, in other countries, which I do, and think is wonderful. But then at the same time, there's so much input, and I don't know if you're like me, but I feel like, it makes me want to cry, makes me want to, get so angry, throw things at the TV, and that there's a kind of amplification that happens online, on Facebook or social media, that doesn't happen when you actually, Ali Cobby Eckermann, who was a First Nations poet from South Australia, she said, when you sit down at the University of the Campfire, there's something about bodies being in the room or in space where people are willing to kind of sit together and actually sit with discomfort, sit with, comfort as well. That kind of brings the, the extremes closer together. And I think, that's what we seem to have lost over the last, almost 2 years now. Feels like 10 years. That, so the work then maybe is, how do we actually be in the University of the Campfire, or the classroom of the campfire, while we inhabit so much of this space that actually is about the amplification of feelings, of swinging from one extreme to another. So maybe, our task as storytellers is not to swing, not to jump, not to, and I do those things, but to kind of be still. I mean, I don't know if that answers the question or not. And I don't mean like kind of new age meditating, although those things are good. I mean something else, a kind of, willful stillness that doesn't take you out of your space, but actually lets you sit in it, in whatever kind of, things are coming at you in that space.
Yeah, that resonates profoundly, Beth, that idea of the moderating impact or influence of bodies in space together. I have a question from Keen Wong. I think you mentioned you'd contributed to his anthology earlier. So Keen, thank you for your question. His question is, did you find the collective euphoria you gauged in a brief Malaysia Baru more about a sense of relief when up close, or was there a performative change that was most alluring if there's a narrative to share?
I think there was definitely euphoria and relief, and that was kind of wonderful to be part of, when you're there. I wasn't there when it happened, that thing I was saying, the elastic kind of stretched a different way and I was somewhere else, and I missed all the kind of big moments in this story that I'd been following for quite a long time. What was the second half of that question?
Sorry, I've dismissed it, but it's about, was there a performative change that was most alluring if there's a narrative to share?
I think there is something about the kind of performative aspect to storytelling, especially life writing, that eyewitnessing of particular moments. There is something performative about that, which kind of played out in many, many ways in the accounts of what happened and who contributed to that huge change. And many people did, huge amount of people, actually. I remember my colleagues, Malaysians here, busting their guts to get the votes back in time, because the voting period for postal votes was tiny. And so people were hand carrying votes, back to Malaysia. So it's partly performative, but that performance is based on something, that there is something there. And maybe, the task also is to kind of look at the performance, and kind of, but maybe not dismiss it as a performance, and again, like get under the skin of the performance and see what is happening. I asked it. So when I was talking about the questions that you ask, give you the answers, that you want quite often. And we see, like, journalists get really annoyed when you don't give them the answer that they're looking for that tells the good story. So I've been going like, okay, Kerajaan gagal, like everything's gone back now to what it was, which is another extreme way of looking at, what happened with that brief period of Pakatan Harapan being in power, that it was over, it was over too soon. But I think, what friends of mine, who are activists and have been working on this for all of their lives, since they were ratbag activists in the SRC at Sydney University, which is where I met them, a lot of them, they take a different view, in that this is Malaysia Baru. This, changing the prime minister 3 times in 3 years practically, hadn't happened since independence. For 50 or 57 years, as if that's 90, I can't count, especially this time of day. But in Malaysia Baru, these things can happen. So you have coalitions that actually function like coalitions. You have, not one block holding power, when, now many more negotiations have to take place. And so, democracy is, functioning, even though it isn't functioning in ways that, many of us might like. There is something that is happening in this Malaysia Baru that was different to what it was previously.
Yeah. And that is a perfect segue to the last question, which has come in from 2 of our audience members regarding your book, Malaysia Baru. They're not really questions, but could you please tell the audience a little bit more about your book?
So this is like my book that I'm not writing right now,
yeah.
or I'm like sneakily, writing about something else, or when I'm talking about it, I'm trying to talk about something else. Yeah, so it's kind of about, it's about traveling in Malaysia, I think, which is one of my loves. And it's also about, after having, lived away from Malaysia for a really long time, in Australia, and in France, where I was for a while. It's about trying to find, what is the space for me in this Malaysia Baru, was part of that project, and to see what had changed. What were the possibilities there, and they were huge. I was actually returning like twice a year. Like, I'm really sorry about the air miles, and perhaps it's a good thing that we can't do that now. We'll have to take a ship, and have longer breaks between semesters. Yeah, so this book, it's kind of still there, but COVID really put a spanner in the works, and it also kind of put a spanner in the way I was approaching it, and thinking about it. So today's talk is partly me trying to rethink the writing of that book. Yeah, so yeah, it's in my computer, a lot of it, as small pieces, but there's no kind of grand narrative at the moment.
Sounds like you're working your way towards or around it, and it will come when it's ready. And certainly I'm really looking forward to it. Beth, thank you so much for sharing your time with us tonight. I hope this has been useful for you in approaching the book, reapproaching your book. But honestly, it's always a joy to hear the way you think, and the way you write and the way you approach writing. So Beth, really want to thank you for joining us for this webinar tonight. I'm sure the audience has absolutely loved it as well. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalie. No, it was really, really, really good actually for me to kind of actually plunge back into this, which I had been avoiding.
Yeah.
So yeah. So thank you so much for asking me, and thank you everyone for your great questions. And
yeah. So
best wishes to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have another Heritage in the Arts webinar coming up next week. We're going to be joined by Dr Yvonne Lowe from the University of Sydney's Department of Art History. And Yvonne is going to be talking to us about women's archives, Wool Manifesto, Dr Malani, and a discourse on hospitality in Southeast Asian art history. promises to be a great talk. And of course, Malaysia is in the news again, as you mentioned, Beth. So I would like to draw your attention to an event that we're hosting in a couple of weeks' time, Malaysia's Back to the Future, which I think Keen has actually been involved in putting together, but that's going to be on the 16th of September at 12 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. So please take a look at the SEAC website if you'd like to attend that Malaysia event. Once again, Beth, thanks so much for sharing your knowledge and storytelling with us tonight. Hope to see you around the campfire in person again soon.
Yes, fingers crossed. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Beth.
Natalie. Thanks, everyone.